I want to start today by asking you, the listener, just a really direct question. When you hear the name B.R. Ambedkar, what immediately comes to your mind?
Right, it's usually one very specific image.
Exactly. For most people around the world, and definitely within India, it's a monumental legacy, but it's very specific. He's universally recognized as the chief architect of the Indian Constitution.
The ultimate champion of Dalit
Yeah,
rights.
the man who just relentlessly fought against the oppressive caste system.
Yeah.
And I mean, that legacy is incredible. It's completely undeniable. But today, we're going to peel back those historical layers a bit.
We really are. We're looking at a side of his identity that honestly somehow just got filed away in the basement of history.
Yeah, it's wild. Okay, let's unpack this. Because discovering this practically erased economist side of such a famous political icon has been genuinely mind-blowing for me.
I think it's a profound historical oversight, really. We're talking about his identity as one of the sharpest, most rigorous, and structurally focused economic minds of 20th century India.
Because we're so used to seeing him in this one very specific historical lane, right? Usually holding a copy of the Constitution or leading a massive social movement.
Right.
To suddenly realize he was operating at the highest levels of macroeconomic theory, it just completely shifts the paradigm.
It forces us to reevaluate everything he did, honestly. Because while the world rightly remembers his political and social analysis, his structural economic architecture is, well, it's the missing puzzle piece.
The missing piece that explains the whole worldview.
Exactly. Ambedkar didn't just fight the social evil of caste, he diagnosed its underlying economic engine. He understood on a purely structural level that you simply cannot build a modern functioning economy on a rigged labor force.
You can't build a 20th century nation on a feudal distribution of human capital.
No, you really can't. It's inherently distorted.
And that is the core thesis, right?
Yeah.
That's the big aha moment we're exploring in this deep dive. Today we're going on a chronological journey through his economic thought.
Tracing his evolution.
Right. Starting from his time as this highly technical academic critiquing colonial currency systems in the 1920s. And then we'll follow his logic as he turns that exact same analytical lens inward.
To diagnose the Indian labor market.
Exactly. Leading to these incredibly radical blueprints for dismantling the caste system through agriculture and industry in the 1940s.
And finally, confronting how these theories, which were, largely ignored at the time, perfectly predict so many of modern India's most pressing development struggles today.
We're basically tracing a line from the macroeconomics of global currency exchange right down to the microeconomics of a single worker in a village.
Or a factory worker. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the unifying thread through all of his work is this relentless pursuit of identifying inefficiencies, finding the monopolies, finding the structural distortions wherever they exist.
So to understand how someone learns to diagnose a rigged system so perfectly, I feel like you really have to look at where they first learned to spot the rigging. And for Ambedkar, that wasn't initially in the villages of India. It was actually in the highest academic institutions of the West, looking at how the British Empire was managing money.
Yes, which brings us to his 1923 doctoral dissertation at the London School of Economics. It has this rather dry title, The Problem of the Rupee.
I mean, it sounds dry, right? Like a textbook.
It sounds incredibly dry, but it's actually a highly volatile, intellectually aggressive piece of work.
Wow.
You have to understand the context here. This wasn't a piece of political activism. This wasn't some pamphlet being handed out at a nationalist rally.
Right.
This was highly technical, rigorous monetary economics produced right at the very center of the empire. He was taking on the British financial establishment using their own mathematical models.
Which is such a flex. I mean, he'd already studied at Columbia University in New York, and now he's at the LSE.
Yeah.
He is deep in the academic trenches here.
Very deep.
And the main target of his dissertation was the currency system the British had imposed on India, specifically something called the gold exchange standard.
Right.
Now, before we really get into his critique, we need to establish some baselines for you, the listener, because the term gold standard gets thrown around a lot in history class. But gold exchange standard is a bit different. Let's break that down. What exactly was the mechanism he was targeting?
Well, to put it simply, under a pure gold standard, a country's currency is directly backed by physical gold held in its own vaults.
Like Fort Knox style.
Exactly. Anyone can theoretically exchange their paper money for actual physical gold. But the British didn't give India a pure gold standard.
Of course not.
Right, they implemented a gold exchange standard. In this system, The Indian rupee was not backed by gold held in India.
Okay.
Instead, the rupee was artificially pegged to the British pound sterling, and the pound sterling was what was backed by gold in London.
Oh, I see. So India's currency was essentially tethered to the currency of its colonizer rather than having its own independent value.
Precisely. And this gave the British authorities in London the power to artificially manage and manipulate the exchange rate between the rupee and the pound. And what's remarkable here is that Ambedkar was rigorously critiquing the mechanics of this system, proving how it was inherently exploitative way before John Maynard Keynes made those kinds of critiques mainstream.
Wait, really? Before Keynes?
Yes. Keynes was looking at these systems from the center of the empire, and actually he was often defending them in the early days. Ambedkar was dissecting them from the perspective of the colonized periphery.
That is such a fascinating dynamic. So what was his central, mathematical argument about how this specific currency policy is being used? How did this peg actually hurt India on the ground?
His central argument was that the currency policy of British India was explicitly designed for colonial extraction. It was not designed for domestic economic stability or growth or anything like that.
Extracting wealth.
Exactly. He focused heavily on this concept of monetary sovereignty. For any country to industrialize, to build domestic wealth, to manage its own inflation, it absolutely needs to have control over its own money supply. And it needs stable, naturally determined exchange rates. Without monetary sovereignty, you simply cannot plan an economy. You can't encourage domestic investment in factories.
And you can't protect your local industries from getting completely wiped out by foreign imports.
You're completely vulnerable.
Now, the sources mentioned that he used the concept of purchasing power parity to prove this extraction. Let's pause there for a second. Because purchasing power parity is, it's one of those macroeconomic terms that sounds incredibly intimidating.
It does.
Break that down for someone who hasn't taken a grad-level economics course. How did he actually use this concept?
Sure. So purchasing power parity, or PPP, is essentially a way to measure the true value of different currencies by comparing how much it costs to buy the exact same basket of goods in different countries.
Like literally a basket of groceries.
Right, like basic food, clothing, standard items. If a basket of those basics costs a certain amount of rupees in Bombay and an equivalent basket costs a certain amount of pounds in London, the exchange rate between the two currencies should logically reflect that ratio.
Okay, that makes sense. So if the exchange rate strays too far from what things actually cost on the ground in real life, something artificial is happening.
Exactly. Or rather, that gap highlights the distortion. Ambedkar looked at these massive historical tables of prices in India versus prices in Britain. He literally calculated the purchasing power parity.
Did the math.
He did the math, and he mathematically demonstrated that the British authorities were artificially keeping the value of the rupee too high relative to its actual purchasing power.
Okay, let me translate this into a scenario that might be a bit easier to visualize, just to really nail down why an artificially high currency is so disastrous for a colonized country.
Go for it.
Imagine you were a worker living in a massive company town. You know, the setup, the corporation owns the houses, the grocery store, the hospital, everything.
A classic closed economic loop, designed completely for control.
Right. And instead of paying you in regular national currency, the bosses pay you in company scrip. Now, imagine the bosses also control the exchange rate of that company scrip against the outside world's money. Let's say you decide you want to buy some specialized tools from outside the town to start your own little side business.
You want to become independent.
Yeah. You want to make your own products, maybe sell them back to the town, but suddenly the bosses change the value of the scrip. They manipulate the exchange rate so that buying anything from the outside becomes prohibitively expensive.
Wow.
But the manufactured goods that they sell you at the company store are kept artificially cheap.
Which creates a scenario where you are essentially forced to keep buying from them. You consume their products, but you can never accumulate the necessary globally valued capital to actually build a competing business.
Yes. The bosses control the value of the money itself. So the extraction of wealth isn't just happening through low wages.
It's baked into the very medium of exchange.
Exactly. The system ensures the workers can never save effectively, they can never invest, and they can never challenge the monopoly. Is that essentially what Ambedkar was accusing the British Empire of doing to India with the manipulated rupee?
That is a highly accurate way to visualize it. By manipulating the exchange rate between the rupee and the pound sterling, The British administration was effectively dumping goods.
Right.
They would artificially manage the rate to make British manufactured goods, textiles, machinery, consumer items much cheaper to import into India. Domestic Indian manufacturers simply could not compete with those artificially lowered prices.
So early Indian industrialization was basically suffocated in its crib.
Completely
And while at
suffocated.
the same time, this manipulation affected what India was sending out, right?
Yes. Simultaneously, the managed currency ensured that Indian raw materials, the cotton, the indigo, the agricultural products that the British factories desperately needed to keep their own industrial revolution churning, were incredibly cheap to export to Britain.
Unbelievable.
Ambedkar used the purchasing power parity data to prove that this wasn't an accident of the free market. It wasn't just that British factories were somehow naturally better. It was a deliberate, engineered macroeconomic policy of extraction.
It's just brilliant analysis. It's cold, hard, undeniable, math-proving exploitation. He wasn't appealing to the morality of the British Parliament.
No, he was showing them their own rigged ledger.
But here's the thing that really stands out to me when looking at his trajectory. If his early work in the 1920s was so heavily focused on these massive macroeconomic forces,
Global currency, gold standards.
right, international trade balances, central banking, how does a thinker transition from looking at global currency to looking at the poorest people on the ground in a rural village?
It seems like a leap.
It seems like a massive intellectual leap, from the halls of the London School of Economics to the dust of an agrarian society.
It might seem like a leap on the surface, but if you really follow his logic, it's the exact next necessary step in the equation.
How so?
Well, Ambedkar realized that monetary sovereignty, getting the British out and controlling the currency, was only step one. Let's run a hypothetical scenario based on his thinking.
Okay.
Let's say India achieves independence tomorrow. They kick the British out, they take control of the central bank, fire up the printing presses, and establish a perfectly fair, stable exchange rate.
The perfect macroeconomic canvas.
A perfect canvas. Ambedkar looked deeply at the internal sociological structure of India and realized that even with perfect sovereign money, domestic economic growth would still be fundamentally impossible if the internal labor market was broken.
Oh, I see.
You can have the best currency in the world, but if the people using it are trapped in an anti-economic social structure, the nation will still fail to industrialize or prosper.
Because the company-town dynamic we just talked about, it wasn't just being run by the British at the international level.
Yeah.
There was a much older, much more insidious company town operating at the micro level within every single village across the subcontinent.
That is the crucial pivot in his thinking right there. And this moves us from the macro level of currency down to the micro level of the workers. This brings us to his core diagnosis, which is arguably his most profound and honestly most overlooked contribution to economic thought.
Okay.
Ambedkar's great realization was that the caste system wasn't just a moral failing. It wasn't merely a social prejudice or a religious hierarchy or a human rights violation, though it was certainly all of those things.
Right, absolutely.
It was a devastating systemic economic inefficiency.
We really need to pause and sit with this concept for a moment, framing caste as an economic inefficiency. Because normally, when society discusses caste, the conversation is entirely framed around dignity.
Dignity, violence, segregation.
Exactly, social justice.
Yeah.
And those elements are obvious and paramount. But Ambedkar was putting on his economist hat and looking at the society like a broken machine.
Yes.
What was his central structural economic argument against the caste system?
His central argument was that the caste system artificially and forcibly locks people into hereditary occupations. Okay. It's an economic system that dictates what job you will do, what skills you're allowed to learn, and what compensation you can expect based entirely on the family you are born into.
So it fundamentally ignores your individual talent.
It ignores talent, your natural inclination, your work ethic, or even the actual changing demands of the broader market.
And from a purely economic standpoint, regardless of the morality, that is a recipe for disaster.
It's a total catastrophe for any nation attempting to modernize. Think about the massive ripple effects of this system. If occupations are hereditary, you entirely kill free market competition.
Because nobody can compete for a job outside their caste.
Exactly. And you suppress wages across the board. Why? Because a particular caste of laborers who are assigned the most physically demanding or socially stigmatized work, they cannot negotiate for better pay.
Right. They can't threaten to withhold their labor or just say, hey, I'm moving to a different, higher-paying profession.
They can't. They are a captive, monopolized labor pool.
The sources quote him using the term dead weight loss to describe this. I know that's another heavy economic term.
Mm.
Let's clarify what dead weight loss means in the context of human labor.
Sure. So, deadweight loss is a concept used to describe economic value that is simply lost to the void. It benefits no one.
Okay.
And it happens because of an inefficiency or a market distortion. In a normal market, if someone is willing to pay for a service and someone is willing to provide it, a transaction occurs and value is created.
Makes sense.
But if a rigid law or a social rule prevents that transaction from ever happening, the potential value is permanently lost.
This is essentially measuring the cost of wasted potential.
Exactly. And it goes well beyond just the individual worker's lost wages. It affects the entire economy's ability to innovate, to adapt, and to allocate resources efficiently. This brings us to the concept of capital allocation.
Okay, let's get into that.
In a functioning, dynamic economy, if there's a sudden demand for, say, engineers or skilled mechanics because a new industry is booming, people will see that demand.
They see the jobs opening up.
Right. They see the higher wages being offered, and they will naturally move to learn engineering or mechanics. Human capital and investment naturally flow to where they are most efficient and most needed.
But a rigid caste structure strictly forbids this fluidity.
It forbids it completely.
You can't just decide to become a mechanic if your caste dictates you must be a farm laborer.
Precisely. A modern economy requires constant fluidity and adaptability just to survive technological changes and global shifts. Caste is the ultimate rigid economic straitjacket. It actively prevents the labor force from adapting to new economic realities.
You know, I was trying to think of a way to visualize this structural rigidity, and it made me think of playing a complex strategy board game.
I like analogies.
Yeah. Imagine you sit down with a group of friends to play a game that requires resource management, long-term planning, adapting to the board. Normally, everyone starts with relatively equal opportunities, and you make choices based on the changing conditions.
Right, a level playing field.
But imagine if this specific game has a horrific set of rules. Your strategy, your resources, and your ultimate role in the game are permanently assigned to you the moment you open the box.
Before you even roll the dice.
Exactly. Before you even look at the board, you open the box, and the rules dictate. Player 1, because of the arbitrary piece you randomly drew, you are the only one allowed to buy property and collect rent.
Wow.
Player 2, you are only allowed to sweep the board and manage the discarded pieces. Player 3, you are only allowed to build houses, but you must give them to Player 1 for a fraction of their value.
It completely destroys the premise of the game.
It really does. It doesn't matter if Player 2 is actually a brilliant strategic mind who could build an incredible, efficient real estate empire that benefits the whole board. And it doesn't matter if Player 1 is completely incompetent and squanders all the resources.
The game is instantly rigged.
It's fundamentally, structurally uncompetitive.
That analogy perfectly captures the systemic deadweight loss Ambedkar was diagnosing. When a society forces a brilliant potential carpenter or a natural engineer or a gifted administrator to be a street sweeper simply because of their birth, the entire society loses the value of that carpentry, engineering, or administration.
Everyone loses.
Everyone. And conversely, when you allow a demonstrably incompetent person to manage vast tracts of land or societal resources simply because they were born into an upper caste landowning family, the entire society suffers from their mismanagement.
That makes total sense.
Ambedkar forcefully argued that the caste system was a system of forced economic segregation that actively impoverished the entire nation. It was wasting human capital on a staggering continental scale.
It's such a clinical, almost chillingly logical way to look at systemic oppression. He wasn't just standing on a podium saying this system is morally abhorrent, though he definitely did say that.
He certainly did.
But he was looking the national planners in the eye and saying, this system is stupid. This is making us all poor. You cannot build a rich nation with this.
And we absolutely must remember the historical context of his time. He was writing and diagnosing this while India was actively trying to figure out how to modernize and throw off the British yoke.
Right, the nationalist movement.
Yes. He was looking at a society, and particularly at nationalist leaders, who desperately wanted to build modern infrastructure, modern industries, and a powerful independent state. And he was pointing out a fatal flaw. You cannot build a skyscraper on a foundation of quicksand.
The national labor market was the foundation.
And it was entirely distorted. You can't just import factories and expect them to work if the workers inside them are still operating under feudal, hereditary rules.
Which brings us to an uncomfortable reality. Because this isn't just ancient history. This isn't just a critique of the 1920s or 1940s. When we compare these historical ideas to modern problems in the Indian labor market, the shadows of this rigged board game are still incredibly visible, aren't they?
They absolutely are. It's vital to recognize that while the strict legal enforcement of hereditary occupations has been abolished by the very constitution Ambedkar helped draft, mind you, the deep structural legacy of that economic architecture remains heavily entrenched.
You can see it everywhere.
We see it manifesting clearly today in the massive informal labor sectors. We see it in deeply trapped wages where specific demographics and marginalized communities are still overwhelmingly concentrated in low-paying, hazardous, or precarious work.
Like sanitation, manual scavenging, brick kilns.
Exactly. We see it in the severe lack of upward social and economic mobility.
It's as if the ghost of that rigged board game is still heavily influencing the way the economic dice are rolled today. The rules aren't explicitly written on the box anymore, but everyone is still playing by them out of habit and, entrenched power dynamics.
That is a very accurate assessment. And I think it's important to note here, for you, the listener, that as we discuss the political, social, and modern impacts of these structural inequalities, our goal is to look at this strictly through Ambedkar's academic economic lens.
Right, we're not taking political sides here.
We are exploring his diagnosis of labor market inefficiencies and structural monopolies. We're looking at the math and the mechanisms of what he was pointing out and observing how historical economic structures cast incredibly long shadows.
Right, we are looking at the nuts and bolts of the machine he was analyzing. And that brings us to a really critical juncture in his intellectual journey. Because once you diagnose a disease this deeply rooted...
You need a serious cure.
Exactly. A disease that isn't just a surface-level symptom you can cure with a quick policy tweak, but a genetic mutation in the very DNA of the national economy. You have to design a radically different kind of treatment.
You cannot just adjust the exchange rates, offer a few microloans, and hope the free market sorts it out.
Which brings us to the next phase of his work. Diagnosing a terminal illness in the economy is one thing. Formulating the treatment plan is where the rubber meets the road.
Right.
In the 1940s, specifically with his 1947 draft for a document called States and Minorities, Ambedkar transitioned from diagnosis to prescription. And this was a chaotic, pivotal period. India was hurtling toward independence, the British were leaving, and the nation was desperately trying to figure out what kind of economic and social structure it was going to adopt.
The stakes couldn't have been higher.
And Ambedkar, true to form, targeted the very foundation of rural inequality. He targeted the ownership of land.
This is where his economic thought becomes truly radical. And I mean radical in the most literal sense of the word, addressing the root of the issue.
Really? Let's hear it.
In the States and Minorities document, which he prepared for the Constituent Assembly, he proposed sweeping fundamental agricultural reforms. Specifically, he pushed for the state ownership of agricultural land and the mandatory implementation of collective farming.
Okay, here is where it gets really interesting and, frankly, highly controversial. State ownership of all agricultural land.
Yes.
That is not a small incremental policy tweak. That is a massive tectonic shift in how society operates. I have to ask, why did he think such an extreme measure was necessary?
It's a fair question.
Why couldn't the newly independent government just implement, say, robust minimum wage laws for farm workers, or perhaps some standard moderate land redistribution where they take a little from the biggest landlords and give it to the poorest?
To understand the necessity of his radical approach, we have to deeply contrast his model, what is often categorized as a state socialist land model, against traditional private ownership systems.
Okay.
And crucially, we have to analyze it specifically through the lens of the caste system, which, as we've established, was the core of his entire economic worldview. Ambedkar's logic was incredibly precise and mathematically driven. He argued that in a society entirely dictated by caste hierarchy, private land ownership will always, inevitably, reproduce inequality.
Because of the mechanism of inheritance.
Precisely. Because land inheritance rigidly follows caste lines. Let's trace the logic.
Walk me through it.
If you have a system of private property in a village where, historically, for centuries, only the upper castes have been permitted to own land by religious and social decree, then agricultural wealth is entirely concentrated in those specific families.
Right.
When those landowners die, the land passes down to their children, who are naturally of the same caste.
The wealth stays locked within a closed demographic loop.
Exactly. Meanwhile, the lower castes, particularly the Dalits, who have been historically barred from owning land and forced by the system to work as landless agricultural laborers, they have absolutely no assets to pass down.
Nothing.
When a landless laborer dies, they pass nothing to their children but the social expectation to continue being a landless laborer. They inherit landlessness.
They essentially inherit a negative economic balance.
Exactly. So if you try a modest, liberal land redistribution program, taking a few acres here and giving them to a landless family there, it ultimately fails.
Why is that? Because they just sell it back.
Yes. Because the entrenched economic, social, and political power of the traditional landowning castes will eventually allow them to buy back, coerce, or consolidate that land over time.
Ah,
The marginalized family might face a bad harvest, incur debt, and be forced to sell the land right back to the original landlord. The gravity of the system inevitably pulls the wealth back to the top.
wow.
Private property, in Ambedkar's view, was the very mechanism that locked caste inequality into place, generation after generation. It was the engine of permanent monopoly.
Okay, so let's walk through the mechanics of his proposal to actually stop this. How was this state socialist model meant to work in action? If I'm a listener trying to picture this rural blueprint, what does it actually look like on the ground in a real village?
Under his proposal, outlined in states and minorities, the state would acquire all agricultural land.
Okay.
Now, it's important to note he wasn't advocating for violent seizure. The private landlords would be compensated, perhaps through long-term state bonds or debentures, but they would permanently lose the private title, the monopoly control, over the land.
Right. The state holds the title.
Yes. The state would then consolidate and divide this land into standard-sized, economically viable farms. And here is the crucial mechanism. The state would lease these farms out to families or groups of families to cultivate them collectively.
And the composition of these collective farms is the key, right? They would be leased out regardless of the farmer's caste.
That is the whole point. The
Yeah.
collective farms would be composed of people from various castes working together as co-tenants of the state. The state would provide the necessary capital, the seeds, the modern tractors, the irrigation, the fertilizer.
So the state is the ultimate backer.
Yes. And the agricultural produce would be distributed among the workers based on their labor input, with a portion going back to the state to pay for the capital investment and to fund public services.
This is a fascinating sociological mechanism disguised as an economic policy.
It really is.
Because it isn't just about trying to increase agricultural yield or efficiency, though I'm sure modernizing agriculture was part of his goal. It was a mechanism explicitly designed to forcibly sever the chain of caste-based inheritance.
Exactly.
Let me make sure I'm grasping the absolute magnitude of this. If the state owns the land and you are just a tenant farmer, you cannot pass that land down exclusively to your caste-privileged children. The cycle of inherited monopoly is instantly broken.
That is the brilliant structural nature of his thought. It wasn't based on sentimentality or a romanticized view of communal living.
Right.
It wasn't based on a desire for political vengeance against the landlords. It was a cold, calculated, structural economic reset button. He looked at the math and realized that as long as the primary means of production, which in rural India meant agricultural land, were monopolized by specific castes, social equality was mathematically impossible.
You cannot legislate equality if one group owns the earth and the other group is forbidden from touching it. I understand the logic completely, but I have to aggressively push back here, or at least ask the tough questions that I'm sure many listeners are pondering right now.
Please do.
You are talking about the state confiscating all agricultural land. That represents a staggering centralization of power.
It does.
It requires an incredibly powerful bureaucratic state. And historically, if we look around the world, state-run collective farming has had a lot of, let's say, very mixed and sometimes disastrous results.
Yes, undoubtedly.
We've seen it lead to massive inefficiencies, coercion, and even horrific famines in other countries. Did Ambedkar think this was the only way to solve the problem? Was he naive to the dangers of state power? Or was he suggesting this as a temporary shock to the system, like a way to reset the board before returning to a more normal market?
That is a deeply important question, and it's a critique that was leveled at him during his time as well. It's crucial to understand that Ambedkar was not a blind, authoritarian ideologue.
Right. He literally wrote the Constitution.
Exactly. He was heavily influenced by liberal democratic principles. He studied the U.S. Constitution deeply, and he valued individual liberty and fundamental rights highly. He was very well aware of the dangers of state overreach.
Okay.
However, he believed that in the specific context of India's rural economy, the market was already so deeply distorted by centuries of rigid caste monopolies that a traditional free market approach would be entirely ineffective.
Because a free market relies on everyone having relatively equal access to enter the market in the first place.
Exactly. In a village deeply entrenched in caste, a free market would simply be a free market for the already powerful to continue exploiting the powerless without any interference.
The coercion was already there.
The social coercion already existed, yes, it was just privatized. Ambedkar saw state intervention not as an end in itself, not as an ideological purity test, but as an absolute pragmatic necessity to break the private monopolies.
So the board game was already so rigged, and the players were already using so much coercion, that letting people just keep playing freely wasn't going to fix anything. The state literally had to flip the board.
That is exactly how he viewed it. Whether he intended state ownership to be a permanent feature of the Indian economy or a transitional phase to break the back of feudalism is actually debated among scholars.
That makes sense.
But he was absolutely adamant that the state had a moral and economic obligation to forcefully intervene when the free market was structurally designed to perpetuate inherited generational oppression. He essentially argued that the danger of a powerful state was less immediate than the reality of the suffocating social tyranny of the village.
And it is incredibly striking and somewhat tragic to look at how relevant these ignored blueprints are today. Because his proposals for state socialism and agriculture were essentially rejected by the Constituent Assembly.
Yes, they were deemed too radical.
Too radical. But when we look at the modern Indian landscape, we are constantly seeing debates, protests, and immense crises surrounding rural distress.
Yes, the agricultural sector in India today, which still employs a massive percentage of the population, is grappling with profound challenges. We see intense, deeply entrenched rural inequality.
Yeah.
We see the severe fragmentation of land holdings, making farming economically unviable for many. We see staggering rates of farmer debt and deep systemic crises of profitability in agriculture.
And a vast amount of that distress is still heavily stratified along caste lines. The landless agricultural laborers, the ones who suffer the most when crops fail or prices drop, they are still overwhelmingly from Dalit and marginalized communities.
Facing stagnant wages, precarious seasonal work.
And virtually no safety net.
Exactly. Today's economic planners, agricultural economists, and policymakers are still wrestling with the exact same rural crises that Ambedkar explicitly predicted would happen.
He saw it coming.
He essentially warned the founders of the nation that if you do not fundamentally restructure land ownership at the birth of the republic, if you do not break the rural monopolies, you will be left with a rural economy that is eternally stagnant, deeply unequal, and constantly prone to crisis.
And they ignored him.
His blueprint was largely ignored in favor of much softer, more gradual, piecemeal reforms. And one could strongly argue that the cost of ignoring that structural reset is still being paid by millions of rural citizens today.
Man. So let's follow his thought process to its next logical conclusion. If the agricultural land is reset, or in the reality of history, even if it wasn't, because the reforms failed, what happens to the people?
Right.
Because Ambedkar intimately knew that even with economic reforms, the traditional Indian village was an incredibly oppressive social space. The level of social surveillance in the village setting, where everyone knows your grandfather, your great-grandfather, and your exact place in the hierarchy. It makes it virtually impossible to escape your assigned role. You can't just reinvent yourself.
You really can't. Which brings us to the next massive pillar of his economic architecture, and arguably his most dynamic solution.
The urban escape.
Yes. Ambedkar's vision for ultimate liberation required a massive demographic and economic shift. It required moving millions of people away from the stagnant, socially hyper-surveilled, oppressive village economy and into a completely different environment.
You can't just fix the farm. You have to create an alternative to the village. And that alternative was the city, and specifically the factory floor.
What's fascinating here is how Ambedkar viewed industrialization, especially in contrast to his contemporaries.
This blew my mind when I read it.
Right. While many major thinkers of his time, most famously Mahatma Gandhi, heavily romanticized the traditional Indian village and viewed modern industrialization and massive machinery with deep suspicion, Ambedkar held the exact opposite view.
He famously referred to the Indian village as a sink of localism and a den of ignorance.
He did. He saw the modern factory as an unparalleled tool of social emancipation.
He looked at smokestacks, assembly lines, and heavy machinery, and he saw freedom, which is a very counterintuitive idea for a lot of people today,
It is.
because we often associate early industrial factories with, Dickensian exploitation, terrible working conditions, environmental degradation. Why did Ambedkar believe that industrial wage labor was the single most powerful force to dismantle the ancient caste hierarchy?
It comes down to understanding the specific sociological mechanism of how industrialization reorganizes human beings in space and time. We need to focus specifically on how the factory environment causes the separation of a worker's economic identity from their past identity.
Okay, let's unpack this mechanism carefully, because this is the absolute core of the urban escape. How does this separation actually happen?
Yeah. Let's compare the two environments. In a traditional village economy, the two identities, economic and caste, are fused together completely. There is absolutely no daylight between them. Your caste identity is your economic identity.
Right.
If you are born into a caste designated for leather working, you do leather work. That is how the village economy knows you, how it values you, and how it dictates your compensation. And because the village is small and intimate, everyone knows exactly who you are. The intense social pressure enforces your economic role.
Right. It is the ultimate lack of privacy combined with absolute economic bondage.
Yeah.
You can't walk to the other side of the village and just pretend to be a blacksmith.
Exactly. You'd be recognized instantly.
Yeah.
But then consider the transition. You leave the village and move to a massive, booming city. You walk onto a modern 20th century factory floor. Let's say it's a massive textile mill in Bombay or a heavy steel plant.
Okay, picture the noise, the scale.
The machinery in that plant does not care who your grandfather was. The blast furnace does not care about your caste purity or your religious background. The machine only cares about one thing: your physical output.
Right.
Can you pull the lever at the right time? Can you monitor the loom? Can you produce the steel quota for the day?
The machine is entirely, coldly indifferent to social hierarchy. It's a purely output-driven environment.
Yes. And because of that mechanical indifference, a profound shift happens. A Dalit worker on a factory floor earns a standardized, negotiated wage. They earn the exact same wage as the upper caste worker standing at the machine right next to them, doing the exact same job.
So the factory fundamentally commodifies human labor.
Yes. And this is a brilliant inversion of traditional economic theory.
How so?
Well, while the commodification of labor is very often critiqued in Marxist or socialist terms as a negative thing.
Right, like a form of alienation where a worker is reduced to a mere cog in a machine.
Exactly. But Ambedkar recognized something profound. He realized that for a population suffering from the deep, visceral, personal oppression of caste, the cold, impersonal nature of commodified labor was actually a massive step up.
Oh.
It was liberating to be treated as a number rather than an untouchable.
It's the anonymity of the urban factory acting as a shield against the hyper-surveillance of the village economy.
That's a great way to put it.
Let's really paint this picture to understand the visceral reality of this transition. Imagine a laborer's life. You leave a village where you are socially forbidden from drawing water from the main public well. Your labor in the fields is essentially expected for free or paid in scraps of grain.
And your physical movements around the village are restricted by ancient tradition.
Exactly. Right. You take a train to a booming city. You clock in at a massive factory. There are 5,000 people working there. Nobody knows your ancestry. Nobody knows your village. You work your 8-hour shift.
Right.
At the end of the week, you go to the paymaster and you receive a wage packet containing standard national currency. You take that neutral currency and you walk out into the city. You can spend it however you want.
You have purchasing power.
You can rent a room in a tenement. You can buy food at a market. You can buy a book. You can send your children to a municipal school. Your labor has finally, for the first time in your family's history, been translated into a neutral, tradable, universally accepted medium: money.
That is a phenomenal way to describe the psychological and economic shift. And that transition begins to fundamentally tear apart the fabric of the caste system.
He has to.
When a marginalized worker gains independent economic power through a standardized factory wage, their economic identity begins to successfully separate from their caste identity. They are no longer defined entirely by their hereditary servitude.
Right.
They are now defined, at least in part, by their new role as an industrial wage earner, a consumer consumer and a participant in the modern urban economy.
It breaks the monopoly of the village landlord.
Exactly. And this is why Ambedkar did not just want a few factories built here and there as a side project.
Mhm.
He strongly advocated for a strategic, state-led vision of rapid, massive
I
industrialization.
see. That was everything.
He wanted a total systemic transformation of the Indian economy from agrarian to industrial. He understood that caste monopolies thrive in stagnant agricultural, low-productivity environments where nothing changes and land is the only wealth.
Right. If there are only 10 jobs in the village, and the village elders control all 10 of them, you are trapped. You have zero leverage.
But if the state deliberately creates a massive, rapidly expanding industrial sector, you create an urban labor market that is simply too large, too chaotic, too fast-moving, and too hungry for manpower to care about enforcing ancient caste rules.
The demand for labor just swallows the social rules.
Yes, the sheer economic demand for labor outstrips the ability of the traditional social hierarchy to control it. Caste-based monopolies simply cannot survive the pace, the scale, and the anonymity of modern, rapid industrialization.
It is an incredibly dynamic, forceful vision of social change. He wanted to basically outgrow the caste system. He wanted to build an economic engine so powerful, so massive, and so fast that it would literally tear the old, rusty chains of hereditary labor to pieces just through the sheer force of its momentum.
That was his ultimate blueprint. He saw industrialization, mass urbanization, and state-led infrastructure development not just as conventional ways to increase the gross domestic product, but as fundamental necessary weapons for sociological demolition.
The factory was the battering ram.
The factory was the battering ram he intended to use against the ancient fortress of caste.
It is so wild to think about this in the context of how we usually talk about history and development. We are so used to separating the disciplines.
Silo everything.
We put the social reformers in one box, fighting for rights and dignity, and we put the economic planners in another box, fighting over GDP and trade deficits.
Yeah.
But Ambedkar was aggressively arguing that you cannot reform the society without fundamentally rewiring the economy.
They are not parallel tracks. They are the exact same thing.
And recognizing that synthesis, I mean, that's the true depth of his genius.
It absolutely is.
So, as we start to synthesize this entire journey, let's bring it all back together for you, the listener. We have traveled a massive intellectual distance today, following a truly brilliant mind. We started all the way back in the 1920s, looking at his highly technical academic critiques at LSE in Columbia.
Right, dissecting the gold exchange standard.
We saw how he exposed the ways the British Empire used the manipulation of the rupee to essentially run a massive continental-scale colonial extraction racket.
Demonstrating his profound grasp of macroeconomics, international trade, and the absolute necessity of monetary sovereignty.
Right. And then we saw how he took that exact same analytical lens, that unique ability to spot structural rigging and hidden monopolies, and applied it to India's internal domestic society.
To the labor market.
He diagnosed the caste system not just as a horrific moral failure, but as a devastating labor market distortion. A system that artificially suppressed wages, killed free market competition, prevented the efficient allocation of human capital, and crippled the entire nation's economic potential.
He identified the rigged board game that was impoverishing everyone.
And because he diagnosed the disease so clearly, mathematically and structurally, he was able to design the specific cures. We looked at his ignored, highly radical blueprints for the rural economy in 1947.
States and minorities?
His push for state ownership of agricultural land and collective farming wasn't about communist ideology. It was a deliberate, calculated mechanism designed to surgically sever the chain of inherited, caste-based wealth and landlessness.
It was intended to be a structural reset button for the deeply unequal countryside.
And finally, we explored his vision for the urban escape, his deeply held belief that rapid planned industrialization and the cold anonymity of factory wage labor were the ultimate weapons for dismantling the caste hierarchy. He saw that commodifying labor was the only way to separate a worker's economic value from their hereditary identity.
When you look at it all together, from the currency critiques to the factory floor, it's a complete, cohesive economic architecture. It's a unified theory of how to build a modern, equitable, industrialized society out of a deeply unequal, colonized, and feudal past.
But the tragedy, and it is a profound modern tragedy, as our source material explicitly points out, is the cost of ignoring this specific blueprint.
The cost is still being paid.
When we look at India's development failures today, we see the exact structural problems he warned about almost a century ago. We see intense ongoing struggles with economic sustainability and true social inclusion,
Massive informal labor sectors.
where millions of people have absolutely no security, stagnant wages, and no upward mobility. We see ongoing agonizing crises in rural agriculture, farmer debt, and unequal land distribution. We see fiscal policies that constantly struggle and often fail to actually uplift the most marginalized communities.
And a very large part of this reality is the direct result of ignoring Ambedkar's structural economic vision.
We, as a global society, and India as a nation, have selectively celebrated his incredible monumental legacy as a constitutional architect and a social crusader. But we essentially filed his economic blueprints in the basement.
We gladly accepted his legal and constitutional framework, which was vital, but we largely bypassed the heavy structural economic engine he insisted was absolutely necessary to make that legal framework actually function for everyone on the ground.
So what does this all mean for you? Why does uncovering this hidden history matter today, whether you are an economics student, a business leader, or just someone trying to understand how the world actually works? I think it highlights the immense danger of putting historical figures into neat, easily digestible little boxes.
It flattens them.
When we assign simplistic labels to complex people saying, he was just the Constitution guy or she was just a social activist, we flatten their genius. We lose the complexity and the utility of their thought.
Ambedkar teaches us that true visionary thinking doesn't respect artificial academic boundaries. You cannot truly understand social injustice without understanding the movement of money.
Right.
You cannot fix inequality without understanding the ownership of land. And you cannot build a modern nation without understanding the structure of labor. It is all deeply and inextricably connected.
And that profound interconnectedness leaves us with a deeply important and perhaps uncomfortable question to ponder based on the text we've explored today.
What's that?
If Ambedkar's ultimate diagnosis was correct, if he was right that social inequality is fundamentally and inextricably rooted in labor market distortions, in the monopolized ownership of capital, and in the generational inheritance of land, then what does that say about our modern approach to justice?
Ooh, that's heavy.
Are modern approaches that focus solely on social representation, on changing language, or on purely political empowerment ultimately doomed to fall short? Are they just painting over the rust because they ignore the underlying economic engine that continues to generate inequality every single day? It certainly makes you wonder if we are all still just staring at the exhaust, complaining about the smoke, or refusing to pop the hood and actually fix the engine.